Welcome back to First Christian Church, a Sunday school this Sunday, and we're going to be focusing in on Genesis chapter 23, 24, and 25. And today we're just going to be talking a lot about some history. And it's important that we understand this history of the Bible. No real crazy stories like we had last week of a father almost sacrificing his son, but it's important we learn history because, there's an old saying that those who do not know history are bound to repeat it, which is another way of saying those who don't know of other people's mistakes in the past are bound to make the same mistakes. And if you learn history, it'll help you avoid making the same mistakes that a lot of people made before us. And it's kind of like when I was growing up, I was a younger child, and I had an older sister, and I would watch when she would get in trouble, and I had the option. I would see why she would get in trouble, what she was doing, and I could either repeat that when I got older and get in trouble myself, or I could avoid that conduct and not get in trouble. And for the most part, I chose to learn from that history and not get in trouble. Not that I was perfect by any means. I was far from it. But I did learn from watching some of my older siblings' errors that were made and tried to avoid those. And so a lot of our study in the Old Testament is seeing the mistakes that some of these guys make in the Old Testament and learning from them. And sometimes their successes as well. We can learn when people do the right thing and how they're rewarded. So learning these history is really important. Last week we talked about Abraham. He finally got his son. Isaac was born, but then God kind of tested him and wanted to see if he would sacrifice him. And just as before the knife came down, an angel cried out and stopped him, and it turned out God didn't want him to sacrifice him after all. And now we're kind of dealing with the aftermath of that. And Genesis chapter 23, if you've got your green Bible here, we'll kind of dive into that. And the story kind of takes a sad turn at this point. Abraham's wife, Isaac's mother, Sarah, passes away. At this point, they're still in Canaan, kind of a foreign land to them, and they didn't have any place to bury Sarah. So the story tells us that Abraham talked with a lot of the locals, and the locals were very friendly, and eventually he was able to purchase a cave, and so he could bury Sarah in that cave. And we know where that cave is today. It's in the city of Hebron, Hebron. If I can figure out how to add a picture of that site during this, I'll do so. If not, you can go online and type in Hebron or Abraham's burial or site or Sarah's burial site, and you'll see there's a building on top of where the cave is. Very sacred site there in Israel or Canaan at this point. And so we have a general idea of where this is at this point in time. And so, Abraham's pretty sad. Isaac is pretty sad. And at this point, Isaac is old enough to have a wife for himself. So it was the custom at that time for the parent to select a spouse for their child. And Abraham wanted to make sure Isaac had a lady that believed in one God, very similar to them. So he really didn't want any of the locals because they really hadn't embraced Abraham's God quite yet. And so he's called one of his servants, his chief servant, Abraham did, and they made him swear an oath, which was really weird. There's some odd things in the Bible, and Abraham told the servant to put his hand on his thigh, the top part of the leg, and swear an oath that he would go back to the old Mesopotamia area of the Chaldees and find a wife for Isaac. And so the servant did put his hand on his thigh and swore an oath. I think the servant was a little concerned whether he could talk somebody into walking all the way back with him to Canaan, because it was a really long walk, like 1,000 miles along the Fertile Crescent. So, any event, so the servant takes off and walks over there back to the old Mesopotamia area that Abraham used to hang out at, and they were sitting there at a well, the servant and the people that went with him, a bunch of camels and things like that. And he prayed to God, the servant did, saying, help me identify who you want for Isaac, Lord, because I know you want somebody special for him. And if you can give me a sign, if they would offer me water to drink from this well, then I'll know that's who you want. Mm-hmm. Well, sure enough, he didn't. It wasn't that too long after he finished this prayer, a young lady named Rebecca came to the well and offered this chief servant of Abraham something to drink and for his camels. And so the servant was very excited, going, "Oh, you're the one." And she's like, "I'm the one what?" And she goes, "I need you to go back and marry this guy who lives over in Canaan." And she's like, "What?" So anyway, she takes off running for the house. I don't know if it was in excitement or fear. I'm not sure which. So they all follow her, and they talk to her family and eventually kind of tell them the story. And they believe that this is the work of God. But eventually, they asked Rebecca, are you sure this is what you would want? Which is interesting because a lot of times women back there didn't get a lot of say in what they wanted. But they gave her some input on this, and she said, "Yes, I'd like to go." And so they packed up, walked the several, 100 miles back to Canaan, where Abraham was, and Isaac. And it's a bit of a love story because as they were approaching, Rebecca could see Isaac out in the field, kind of walking around, and she said, "Who is that?" They said, "Well, that's your future husband." And she got off her camel and ran to him, and apparently it was instant, love at first sight, and they fell in love with each other, and they became married. And then the story kind of turns here at this point in time that Abraham, the patriarch, the father, of many a nation coming forward, only has one son at this point, but he actually married someone else, and he has more children. And remember, actually, he had two sons. I'm mistaken. I forgot about Ishmael, the one with Sarah's servant that he had earlier. So he died, and he had a few sons, but Isaac was the main one. That was the one that was going to get all of his inheritance for the most part. And I think Abraham went ahead and did some gifting to his other sons before he died so that they weren't without. But once he died, then Abraham was buried in the same cave area that Sarah was, there in Hebron. Very sad for Isaac, but eventually, they moved on from that. And Sarah still hadn't had a child yet, and Isaac, they were trying, but they've been married 20 years and they didn't have a son. And eventually Sarah prayed to God, and God heard her prayer, and she became pregnant, and turned out she was pregnant with twins, and twin boys. And these boys apparently were really rough on her. It talks about her pregnancy being really tough, and I guess they were even fighting in her belly, and eventually the day came for her to give birth, and the prediction was made before the birth that the younger of the two twins would be over the older one, that the older one would serve the younger, which was really rare because the firstborn was usually the big deal. Anyway, birthday came, and the first one born was really red, very hairy, and so they named him Esau. And the second one came out, was actually grabbing the foot of Esau as he was going out. The second one came out clutching his heel, and so they named him Jacob. And apparently he wasn't as hairy as Esau. And so that is the birth of Jacob and Esau, which we're going to hear a lot about them as they grow older. And one of the first stories I'll go ahead and tell you is, as we end chapter 25, is that they're older now. Esau was a hunter. He liked a game, like game hunting, and went out and did a lot of that bow hunting. And the story was he went out, and one day he came back home, was just really hungry. I'm like really hungry, and Jacob was cooking a stew. And he said, "Oh, give me some of that stew." And Jacob goes, "Not for free. I would like your birthright since you're the older." And he's like, "What?" And he goes, "Yeah, I want your birthright." And Esau, not having a lick of sense, I don't think, said, "Okay, I'll sell you my birthright." And which means he was going to get more of an inheritance whenever Isaac died than Jacob was. But Esau sold that to Jacob, so Jacob gave him some stew. Well, not sure about the wisdom of that. I'm not sure Jacob should have taken advantage of his brother, and I don't think his brother should have sold a birthright for a pot of stew. So there was a whole lot of strange in that story, but we're going to learn more about that later on. So that's all we're going to do about the story. We're going to turn a little bit to our workbook now, finding our way through the Bible here. We've turned it around, and we're going in the opposite direction now. We've finished up with page 92, I believe, last time. So we're going to start with page 93 and go through page 97 today. And if you're not that far, that's okay. You go at your own pace. We're learning about how to read the Bible, how to identify the books, how to identify the chapters, the verses. And there's a little bit of a test there within the Christmas story within Matthew about finding the chapter and the verse number, and getting a little bit more practice with that, and also within Luke. So I hope you'll have opportunity to work through that workbook and get a little bit more familiar with the Bible. So that's our lesson for this week. I hope you have a wonderful week, and God bless.